Hi everyone, so today I'll be giving you a background on Latin verbs. When I introduce nouns to you, I stress how important it is to have a solid understanding of English grammar when you're learning Latin. But fortunately, English grammar isn't that important when learning verbs. I find that it helps when introducing verbs to make some comparisons between nouns, or comparisons between how nouns work in Latin to how verbs work in Latin. I'll start by making those comparisons, then I'll give you a set list of the 5 characteristics of verbs. Okay, so nouns versus verbs. Okay, so nouns are grouped into declensions. On the other hand, verbs are grouped into conjugations. Okay, so another point of comparison is that nouns use case endings to show what the noun is doing in the sentence. So nouns use case to show function. And verbs also, verbs don't use case, but verbs use the ending of the noun, or ending of the word, to show what its function is. So verbs use suffixes or ending. Okay, so another point of comparison is that the noun suffix shows singular or plural and the case. Okay, on the other hand, the verb suffix also shows singular or plural, but it also shows the tense. Okay, so now that you hopefully have somewhat of a concept of Latin verbs, and hopefully now that your concept is gaining some more focus in your mind, I'll go over the 5 main qualities of Latin verbs. And oftentimes on a test, when you're asked to identify or ID a verb, all you have to do is list these 5 characteristics or qualities. I'll start out by listing these qualities, and then we'll cover each characteristic more in depth, much like we did with the cases in the Intro to Nouns video. They may not make as much sense right now, but hopefully after I explain some more, you'll get a clearer picture of what exactly these characteristics are. So, 5 characteristics of verbs. Okay. So, the first one is voice. Second is mood. Third is tense. Fourth, number. And fifth and final characteristic or quality is the person. Okay. So I'm just going to start and I'll go down the list one by one, and I'll use a different color just to separate them more visually. So I'll start out with voice. Okay, so there are 2 different voices. 2 voices. It can either be active or it can be passive. If the verb is active, then that means that the subject is the one doing the action. On the other hand, if the verb is passive, the subject is having something done to them. So I'll give you an English example of each just to make it clearer. So active verb, the woman loves her pet. That's active because the woman is doing an action. She loves her pet. The passive goes like this. The dog is loved by its owner. And obviously this would be the verb, but it's having the verb done to it. It's passively being loved. So, okay, so next up is the mood. Okay, so the verb can be one of three moods. I'll just make my list. 1, 2, 3. It can be indicative. It can be subjunctive. Or it can be imperative. And this concept may be a bit confusing for you right now, so don't worry about the subjunctive and imperative just yet. All the different verb tenses under the verb tab on the menu are in the indicative mood. The indicative mood has the most tenses and is arguably the most often used. On the other hand, the subjunctive and imperative moods are easier to learn and include less information, so I only made one video for each mood. Okay, so that brings us to our third of our fifth characteristic, tense. Okay, so the tense of a verb indicates when something happens, and there are 6 different tenses, and I'll list them now. Present, which actually is obviously currently happening. Imperfect, which happened in the past and was continuously happening in the past. You'll understand more later when we cover it more in depth. There's future, which obviously has not happened yet and will happen in the future. The fourth is perfect, which happened in the past. The fifth is pluperfect. And finally, you have your future perfect. Okay, so next up we have our fourth characteristic. And that will be our number. And you should already be familiar with this concept if you've covered the nouns already. And basically, number just indicates if it's singular or plural. It indicates whether one person is performing the verb or if multiple people are performing the verb. Consequently, there are 2 kinds of number. There's singular, I'll just abbreviate that, and there's plural. Okay, so that brings us to our fifth and final characteristic, person. Okay, so there are 3 different persons, first, second, and third. Now, the first person can be either I or we if it's plural. The second person can be you if it's singular, or you all if it's plural. And finally, the third can be he, she, it if it's singular, and it can be they if it's plural. Okay, so now that I've given you the 5 basic characteristics of verbs, I'll go through the dictionary entries for verbs, just as I did with the nouns. So let me write down dictionary entry. Okay, so I'll give you an example of the word amo, which is to love, since it's one of the first verbs people often learn in Latin. And based on this dictionary entry, you can form every tense and mood, so that's an important point to remember. Amo, amare, amawi, amatum, or amatus. I'll get more into that later. Amatum, and it means to love. Okay, so basically the dictionary entries for verbs are divided into principal parts. So this is the first principal part, amo. Second, principal part, amare, third principal part, amawi, and finally you have your fourth principal part, amatu. So when I went over nouns in the introductory video, I gave you the function of each of the words in the dictionary entry. Since there are so many verb forms, I will give you the functions of the principal parts as I go over the different tenses and moods. And in the review video, hopefully I'll be able to give you a definitive list of the functions of each principal part. Okay, so one thing I'll go over right now when it comes to the dictionary entry is conjugation. As I mentioned before, a conjugation is to a verb as a declension is to a noun. Just as you can tell the declension of a noun by the dictionary entry, you can also tell the conjugation of a verb this way as well. And you can determine the conjugation by looking at the first two principal parts, specifically the last one or two letters of the first principal part and the last three letters of the second principal part. So now I'll give you examples of each conjugation, and there are actually 4 of them. Actually, 5 of them, excuse me. Okay, so I'll just write conjugations. Conjugations, the example I gave you above was first conjugation. First conjugation, and it's amo, amare, amawi, amatu. And you can tell, as I said, you look to the last letter of the first principal part and the last 3 letters of the second principal part. And based on that, you can tell that the first conjugations will always end in a, and then, o, are. Okay, so now for second conjugation, I'll give you the verb teneo, tenere, tenui, tentum. And, like I said, last 1 or 2, in this case it's actually the last 2 words of the first principal part and the last 3. So it will be eo, ere, for the second conjugation word. Now there's the third conjugation, and that is peto. I'll give you an example. Peto, petere, petivi, petitus. And that, if you look to the last letter, o, ere, will be your endings for the third conjugation, o, ere. And now, it isn't actually fourth as you expect to be next, but it is third, I-O. And it turns out there's actually 5 conjugations. So I'll give you an example. Capio, capere, kepi, captus. If you look to the endings, as implied by the name, third I-O, it ends in I-O and ere. So it's pretty close to third. There's just the obvious I-O for the first principal part. I-O or E-O, ere. Okay, so I'll go next to the fourth conjugation. Fourth conjugation, and I'll give you the example of audio, audire, audivi, auditus. Okay, so again it ends with io, but this time it ends, the second principal part ends in ire. So I'll write that down. Io, ire is your indicator that it belongs to the fourth conjugation. So earlier I made the analogy of a verbal conjugation being kind of like a declension for nouns. The difference is that whereas nouns were taught by declension, starting with the first moving through the fifth as you remember, verbs are taught by tense rather than conjugation. For many of the tenses, conjugation is not that significant, and the verbs are formed the same way regardless of the conjugation. That's why verbs are taught in groupings of tense. However, even though we list the different cases of a verb in groups of tense rather than conjugation, we still call the act of listing these verb forms conjugating. So with that being said, in the next video, we'll be talking about the present tense, and in that video, I'll be showing you how to form your present tense verbs for each conjugation group. Thanks for watching!